She says that empathy itself is not inherently bad. It's a neutral emotion, but it can become toxic when it is not subordinated to objective truth, moral standards, or biblical principles. For example, she describes it as empathy without any other considerations of laws or the Bible, which can blind people to reality and morality. And we could see in our lifetimes, my first knowledge of kind of the larger world outside of my town and my neighborhood and my house was in the late 70s, early 80s with Ronald Reagan and, the existential clash of civilizations, so to speak, between the West and the Soviet Union, communism versus democracy. And, Ronald Reagan was became very pointed. He was controversial for this, but he was the first president really to point out the evils of communism in the Soviet Union's communist empire. And by the way, communism is another example of on paper, a very fair, empathetic model and system that when you implement it in reality leads to depravity and oppression to enforce it. There's just tons and tons of scripture that talk about how we're supposed to be as believers and supposed to act as believers. And that is empathy. If we didn't have any empathy at all and just didn't care about the plight of others, then we're not being Christian. We're not acting as we believe in what God says in the Bible.
Can you read that translation that you have there from Micah 6:8 one more time?
Yeah. Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And this is the Legacy Standard Bible translation.
That's cool. I hadn't thought of that verse in this context before, but I'm glad you brought it up. And the reason I asked you to read your translation again is because the King James that I read over here has slightly different wording. It says, "He has shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And I hadn't made that connection before, but when you brought up the verse, it's exactly what we were just talking about. There's a balance between love, justice, and mercy. And that, as a whole, is what is defined as good. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. And I think that balance is really missing in a lot of the public conversation, and certainly it's missing in a lot of the public demonstrations that we see. You may love mercy, empathy. You may actually even love justice. But if the way you make that argument isn't also humble, probably not making your point as effectively as you would hope.
Good day, everybody. This is Fire for Effect, episode 28. Recording this on January 31st, 2026. And I have with us Marcus Moyer, and I'm James McBride. How's it going, Marcus?
It's going well, man. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. A lot of stuff going on. We were talking off camera like we always do before we start hit the record button. A lot of crazy things going on in the AI world. I mean, it changes every week. This one's pretty significant. We're not going to talk about that today. We're talking about toxic empathy, suicidal empathy, biblical empathy. We got to figure out the title after we recorded, but just before we came on, just read an article in the AI world about this Reddit type chat group that this guy set up with a bunch of AI bots being able to communicate with one another. It was over 1,000 something, and some of the discussions that AI was having with itself were pretty eye-opening to say the least, and very self-aware and very petty and human in way they were kind of arguing with each other and making fun of each other. And anyway, just it was pretty interesting thing that just came up this morning. I saw it on Axios, but you can just Google that, and we might talk about that again. We had an AI episode a while back, 10 or so episodes ago, talking about ethics with the military using AI, and that got a lot of views. So obviously there's a lot of interest in that. By no means experts in it, but some people just like to hear podcast hosts talk about things that are of interest. So maybe coming up episode we'll pull that thread a little bit more.
Yeah, that episode we did a while back, like, didn't even scratch the surface. Like, a couple of amateurs, you know, talking about this, but it's an item of great interest that people have a lot of not just interest but concern about, and a lot of those concerns are valid because it's such a new and developing thing that very few people, perhaps nobody, really understands. As we were talking about off camera, there's a really interesting book that I just finished a couple of days ago. I actually saw an advertisement for it on the subway when I was on my way to work. It was one of the things that was advertised on the wall of the train. I took a picture of it, ordered the book, and it was really entertaining and very disturbing. The name of the book is "If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies," and it was written by two guys who are heavily involved in the AI industry. Recognize the danger, the fact that we're playing with something that nobody, even the people, even its creators, don't really fully understand and can't control. Hence the danger. So anyway, interesting book. If you have in all your free time, you can grab a copy and check it out. It was an entertaining read and a little unsettling.
Yeah, very timely. And so, to the topic of this episode, one of the things that we, when we started the podcast, called a fire for effect to kind of mix the um, military term fire for effect, calling artillery strikes, also meant to, we have the image of the podcast, a sword being hammered into shape under the fire. So kind of a combination of metaphors, just talking about, leading to what makes a good man, a good person, a good society, with truth, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, kind of a lot of different things, kind of leading towards the name for a fire for effect. But one of them being, seeking the truth, and the truth is sometimes painful to hear. And that could be, considered kind of the fire or the hammer coming down on the sword to shape it. But truth ultimately leads to freedom in a lot of different ways to think about that, biblically being one of them. We're Christians and strong believers, and we believe that in biblical truth and how the Bible talks often about, um, you know, Jesus being the truth and seeking what God, God sets the standard for what truth is. Humans do not. Humans spend our lives trying to seek that truth and get close to it. Now, we know that a lot of people don't have that perspective. A lot of people don't believe in God at all, don't believe in Christianity, have different faiths. We get it. But everybody, regardless of your faith, is in some way, shape, or form seeking what truth is, whether it's from a scientific standpoint or another religion. But all human beings are wired to know and to seek what the truth is. Because if we don't live in a world of truth, of what we believe is the truth, it's just chaos, and we don't function well in chaos. We barely function with a rules based society as it is, as as we've seen in the last few years. And we don't want chaos, because chaos brings disorder and brings injustice. So is just something that we all strive for. So it kind of, we've touched on this. We've mentioned a few times on a few episodes the idea of toxic empathy, or empathy being weaponized in our society the last few years. I don't know if we've talked about it explicitly. We have brought up in several episodes the idea of intersectionality, which is an idea coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, I think in the 60s, that breaks people down into physiological characteristics for the most part, and sometimes their beliefs, and breaks them down into dozens of groups that, and then they're racked and stacked based on whether they're oppressed or oppressors within this stack. And it's a framework for people with which to view other people. And I think that's a destructive way to look at things, because even though it's born out of an empathetic purpose, which is kind of the tie-in here, it classifies people. Now, I believe, and I believe Marcus believes, again, biblically, we believe that, I know we believe that God created every individual in his image for a purpose. And the key word there is individual. And yes, he made us individuals and gave a lot of his characteristics that are common amongst certain groups, such as, ethnicity, language. That's learned over time, but obviously, we're born with an ethnicity, but we're born into a culture too, and the cultures can change and do change over time. But what matters is how that he created, our human souls, individual human souls. And that's what matters. And we all have, God-given potential and God-given purpose. So the idea of intersectionality, classifying people into groups, arbitrary groups, and just attributing characteristics on those groups, and then judging those groups based on perceived characteristics is a destructive. Ironically, it's racist. A lot of it can be racist. It's sexist, even though it's designed to combat racism and sexism. So anyway, it's destructive ideology, in my opinion. And I think that's being borne out as time goes on. I think it's contributing to a lot of the cultural chaos that's going on. Now, again, that whole idea is designed to combat, real racism, real sexism that has existed throughout time. So it's born out of an empathetic motivation. But the result is destructive. Now, to combat real societal prejudices and biases, I think the biblical model is obviously I think that is the way to approach it, through the church, through morality based on the Bible, and not a societal structure. And that's hard because humans are flawed. Churches are flawed. We talked about that a lot. You're never going to get perfection on earth. You're never going to get a utopian structure on earth. But there should always be the goal that we're striving towards. So I think it comes again back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, created by God, equal in dignity in God's eyes, with inalienable rights that God gives us all. And with that model, that paradigm, which is we talked about last episode, we talk about often, also summarized in the E pluribus unum, out of many cultures, out of many people, coming to America under the idea of unity in one people, one American people that incorporates other cultures, but adheres to that line of Declaration of Independence, the idea that we're all created equal by God in equal dignity, and we should therefore, our laws and everything should be centered and built around that idea of individual justice and enforcing and protecting individual freedom and liberty. All right, it's a big intro. It sounds like I'm kind of beating around the bush here, but that gets to the idea of empathy and how it's been weaponized through models like intersectionality, but it's often weaponized, especially in modern times, by kind of Marxist ideology that takes real human noble intent, desire, empathetic desire, and weaponizes it and leads to division. So Allie Beth Stuckey is one person that came up with the term recently, toxic empathy, which was needed because I think a lot of Christians were struggling with how it is that, you know, when Marxist ideology uses empathy for its model, and yet, you know, as Christians, we also have empathy. And so how do we argue against a model that uses empathy? Even though we see it's destructive, we see it's divisive, but we can't, in my opinion, we haven't been able to really articulate why that was the case, other than just kind of seeing the results. You know, obviously when you divide with intersectionality, a whole bunch of different groups, well, that's divided, and we see that that's wrong, and it's pits, you know, groups against groups, and that's not good. But again, they're using empathy as kind of the tool that makes that possible. So it's kind of hard to. It confused a lot of people, in my opinion. A lot of Christians fall into that mindset. So Allie Beth Stuckey coming out, she wrote a book. I think it was called Toxic Empathy a couple years ago, 2024. Yeah, it's called Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion, published in October 2024. And she did a good job giving a definition to why this type of empathy has been weaponized and how it is toxic. So I will read her definition of that. She says that empathy itself is not inherently bad. It's a neutral emotion, but it can become toxic when it is not subordinated to objective truth, moral standards, or biblical principles. She frames this in a political and cultural context, claiming that progressive activists exploit toxic empathy by using emotional anecdotes or appeals to compassion to manipulate people, especially Christians, into endorsing agendas that are against the Bible. For example, she describes it as empathy without any other considerations of laws or the Bible, which can blind people to reality and morality. And then we'll get into in a little bit here. God Saad, not a Christian, is releasing a book later this year, set for release in May of 2026, called Suicidal Empathy, subtitled Dying to Be Kind. Very clever. And a while back, 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote a book called, no, I can't remember what it's called. Is it The Mind Virus, if I'm not mistaken? Anyway, he defines suicidal empathy as an extreme maladaptive form of altruism or compassion that is irrationally deployed on the wrong targets, leading to self-destructive outcomes for individual societies or civilizations. He describes it as a mind parasitic mind. That's the name of his older book, The Parasitic Mind, So he describes it as a mind parasite where excessive empathy tricks the emotional system into prioritizing victimhood, avoiding punishment, or showing compassion in ways that undermine security, cohesion, and rational decision making, essentially elevating empathy to a point where it causes societal collapse. So he's kind of takes Allie Beth Stuckey's term toxic empathy, where she's talking about how that weaponizes empathy at the individual and societal level. And Gad-Saad warns that toxic empathy can become suicidal empathy at the civilizational level, which is pretty provocative. And, we could see in our lifetimes, Marcus, we're born in the 70s, and my first knowledge of kind of the larger world outside of my town and my neighborhood and my house was in the late 70s, early 80s with Ronald Reagan and, the existential clash of civilizations, so to speak, between the West and the Soviet Union, communism versus democracy. And, um, Ronald Reagan was became very pointed. He was controversial for this, but he was the first president really to point out the evils of communism in the Soviet Union's communist empire. And by the way, communism is another example of on paper, a very fair, empathetic model and system that when you implement it in reality leads to depravity and oppression to enforce it. So that's just a connection I just hit me just now, and that's very similar down to the toxic empathy level, where you're trying to use empathy to force and guilt and shame people into helping oppressed groups um, in a toxic way. So anyway, that's kind of my big picture introduction to the topic. I want to hear your feedback on it, and I want to get into a little bit later the difference between toxic empathy and biblical empathy and why it's different. So turn it over to you for comments.
Yeah, this is such a huge topic. I mean, if you just Google or you get on YouTube and you just search toxic empathy, so much stuff comes up. It's definitely like squarely in the middle of the public consciousness and conversation. Even people who may not have heard that term before, they're buried in the middle of a culture of toxic empathy on a daily basis. They may not have they may not know the term to apply to what they're seeing and maybe what they're feeling or witnessing, but that is what it is. We've become so comfortable well, I won't say comfortable, but we've almost become inoculated to this idea of intersectionality that you were describing. It's just part of the reality, the cultural reality that we live with and have become used to, almost accustomed to. And intersectionality, it's really just a new term for what the founding fathers called factions or factionalism. And in the Federalist Papers, they talked about the dangers of faction. You mentioned e pluribus unum earlier, out of many, one. Intersectionality or factionalism is the opposite of that. It's ensuring that we never unite. We never become a united front on anything. And in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10, James Madison defined what a faction is. And it's a strikingly similar definition to what we might apply to intersectionality. James Madison's definition of a faction is a number of citizens, whether a majority or a minority, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And that's pick any one of the intersectionality factions, and it's essentially that. It's a group of individuals to unite around some common cause or passion or an identity, and insist on the advancement of their interests, uh, irrespective of and sometimes detrimental to um, good of the community or other citizens. Um, and so creating those factions, identifying those intersectionalities, and then insisting that those groups be treated with empathy is an ideological capture of really of a biblical truth. I think empathy is biblical. Compassion certainly is, and it comes down to definitions, right? We read in Scripture that Jesus, when he saw the multitude, was moved with compassion, and so compassion is a good trait. But just like anything else that's good, anything else that God creates, the devil tries to hijack and pervert it, and twist its use into something that is divisive and detrimental. And this toxic empathy, as it's typically defined, is when we care more about someone's feelings than what is true. It's affirmation without truth and calling it love. So if we accept that definition, it really you have to also define truth. And as we've talked about before on this podcast, that is no longer something that there's a common understanding of. Each one of these intersectionalities, in fact, claim to have their own truth. It's people are told to express their truth as if it's something that's relative and can be applied to a single person, and it's different from person to person. Truth is just truth by default. And so we take this biblical concept of compassion, we twist it into this idea of empathy, and then we insist that in order to be Christ-like and in order to be a Christian, to be a good Christian, you have to be empathetic in the terms and by the definition that these people are applying to it. And I actually heard Josh Howerton talk on his podcast recently where he said, people who don't even believe in the Bible, they don't even claim to be Christians, they will quote it to a Christian and insist that we apply it according to their definition or to their interpretation of the book that they don't even believe in or ascribe to. And so it's our own biblical text, our own religious text weaponized against us, and we're forced to accept it on their terms and by their interpretation. And that, ironically, that tactic, if you will, comes from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. If you've ever read that book, it's fascinating. I think is it 11 rules that he lays out for destabilizing?
Yeah, 11 of 13, I forget.
Country. I don't remember the exact number, but I believe somewhere in the top 5 of that list is the rule that insist that your enemy follow his own rule book. And that's what I think they've attempted to do with this idea of intersectionality and empathy is concerned. And I think we've all, most of us, I think, probably growing up are familiar with that phrase: love your enemies, kill them with kindness. Kill them with kindness is compassion. Empathy, though, is committing suicide by kindness. Suicide by kindness. And as you pointed out, socialism and communism is essentially empathy taken to a suicidal extreme. And what's been placed in front of us, this concept of toxic empathy that we will lay out over the remainder of the episode, is that it is compassion divorced from truth, which becomes dangerous. I think Jordan Peterson actually defines that: separate compassion from truth, It's really just sentimentality. It's kind of a cheap knockoff of actual compassion. And I think it was Oscar Wilde that said, sentimentality is when we want the emotion without the cost of the emotion. And I thought that was a pretty good way to define empathy, toxic
Yeah,
empathy.
it's a perfect segue because that's I was going to get to that next. Is um, the Christian, the biblical perspective of empathy. Um, and again, it's become a theme throughout many episodes of this podcast. Is that it was, I think, episode 24 was the conservative credo episode where we talked a lot about this, where um, we believe the church and the individuals in the church, and we're individuals in the church. Um, we're supposed to be treating helping the downtrodden, the widow, the fatherless, that's mentioned in the Bible, um, hands on. And, a lot of us will do it. And everyone has busy lives, different ability to help people individually. But, if you do it through the church, through tithing and just giving money, not that tithing is that's a whole other topic, whether the Bible says you must tithe or not. But whether you tithe or not, if you give money to the church, you support the church, you volunteer at a church, you're enabling a church to help the downtrodden, the widow, the fatherless. And that is, it's not just because it's a church, that's a big part of it, because the church is helping out of Christian compassion, Christian love, and the Christian idea, the biblical idea that individual people are created by God in God's image. That right there is so important. And therefore we should be treating everybody as if they were created by God in God's image and loving them like the Bible says. And the more that the church does this in our society, in our individual societies around the country and around the world, the less need or the less of a gap there is for the government to do that. Because that's where, when the government does it, it does try to follow some kind of rules and classifications, and it classifies people. And that's where I think this toxic empathy idea and intersectionality is very dangerous, because that's something that the government would tend to want to do, is to classify people into groups and then help those groups. And it takes the human compassion, the human love aspect out of it, even if that's the original motivation behind it. Whereas if a church does it, or individuals, whether you're a believer or not, if there's we believe there's biblical principles that if people follow, and people do this. There's plenty of agnostics, atheists out there who believe that biblical principles are very healthy to a society, and there's many, of course, that think it's not. But when it comes down to love and compassion and helping the individual people, that is empathy, and that empathy is healthy. I look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 says, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." So there's one thing about having compassion about somebody or a group of people, and I mean by a group of people, I don't mean ethnicity or skin color or any of that. I just mean a homeless encampment down the street, or um, a group of people in low income housing somewhere in your town that has needs, or orphaned children, or sex trafficked people. Those are groups that it has nothing to do with their physiological characteristics, but their suffering in some way, shape, or form. And if we bear one another's burdens by personally going and helping those people and praying for those people, that is true empathy in action, versus just classifying people into oppressor-oppressed groups and then judging the quote-unquote oppressor groups. That's not helping anybody. You think it is, but it's just dividing and destroying. and it's not looking at people as individuals. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 5 says, "For each one will bear his own load." So that's the other aspect of it too. With people on the ground helping people in their communities, it's much more effective to help those who want to be helped. You know what I mean? Those who want to get back on their feet if they're, ended up in homelessness because of some kind of terrible situation, temporary situation, medical, divorce, job loss, whatever it is. There's a lot of people who end up in bad situations and become homeless or low income or in need that have a desire to not stay in that situation. And I think that's most people. Um, and people that are in the community, the church that's on the ground, that can get to know these people personally and figure out what their individual specific um, need is, and also loving on them and praying for them, and helping them understand biblical principles such as God created them for a purpose. God gave them their identity. Their identity is not in their situation, things like that. That is where the church helps with empathy, get people and make societies healthy. And then we talked again several times about the family, encouraging the strong family unit, um, you know, strong mother and father in the home, raising children. That's ideal. Now, we don't live in an ideal society. There's all kinds of broken families. That we get that. We understand that. But the idea behind that is, and this is another segue that I almost forgot to get to, is that um, the exploiting the empathy tends to target women more than men. Women, it's borne out by uh, all kinds of statistics and psychological tests and things, are more empathetic on average than men. And we've gone through a period of 20 years or so in our society that I think is kind of waning a little bit, where men were considered toxic, or masculinity, toxic masculinity is considered a bad thing in society, and it can be. And now I think we're seeing there's also a toxic component of femininity, and that can be exploited by empathy, misplaced empathy, which to me reinforces the idea of, again, God creating this order of men and women made differently, made to think differently and view the world differently, with a lot of overlap, but a little bit different, to work together, to balance each other out, to balance, healthy masculinity and healthy femininity are both very, very positive for society, especially when they are working together in families and in society. When you divide by gender and ostracize by gender, or ostracize by different perspectives, um, different, yeah, when you divide in order to ostracize, in order to punish, in order to shame, that's when things start going haywire. That's the other aspect of it, is just that any stereotypical way of looking at the world that a gender has compared to the other, they're not necessarily wrong, and they should strive to work together, which is how God designed it. Which again gets to the biblical concepts of men and women, and how God created us. So that's what I wanted to just talk about just for a second, is just kind of introducing the biblical idea of empathy, because it is very biblical. It's just that it's been hijacked and um, turned against people. So I'll stop there.
I think that's a really interesting observation, and a pretty astute one too, that if people concede for the moment that empathy can be weaponized, I think that's true. I think we've seen it weaponized, right in front of our very eyes. But maybe some people don't agree with that. But for sake of argument, let's concede for the moment that it can be weaponized. If you were the tactician or the strategist that were tasked with the mission of turning empathy into a weapon, how would you do it? And obviously, you would seek as your partners in this people who are most apt to be empathetic. And as you just pointed out, the greatest allies where it comes to empathy, good or bad, is generally women, because women have this innate and wonderful, beautiful characteristic and trait of being nurturers and being compassionate, being caregivers. I don't think it's an accident that the majority of the people who are involved, who are in the healthcare industry and teaching young children, vast majority of them are women. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think society has stovepiped them into those areas. They're naturally drawn to it because of their natural innate desire to care for other people. And that's a good thing. That's a noble thing. But if you were going to try to weaponize that that emotion and that good trait, women are where you would go to find the people who are already empathetic by nature and possibly susceptible to having that nature weaponized. And I think we have seen that in recent days and weeks, months, years. It seems like on the front line of every protest, it is women. Women are leading that. And especially when the protest is aimed at extending at least their definition of compassion to some group of marginalized people that fall into one of those intersectionalities, those factions that we were talking about. And as you were just describing a little bit ago, Jim, the applying that kind of empathy without full context is what can make it dangerous. And I think that's what these a lot of these women have been drawn into. The underlying emotion behind what they're doing, I want to believe, is a good thing. They care about other people and they want people to be treated right and treated fairly. And they've taken that to an extreme, to the exclusion of every other thing that's also important. For instance, justice and truth. And by ignoring the truth that maybe people that are the recipients of all of their empathy, there might be more to those people. And refusing to acknowledge that truth, refusing to acknowledge that love is both truth and compassion, truth and mercy, by emphasizing all one and none of the other, it's not really love. And so the good heart and the good nature and the good natural inherent desire to care for other people and to be empathetic, by putting up those blinders and not seeing the truth or the justice that's also part of this equation, is what has turned it into a weapon. And it's what Jordan Peterson called naive compassion. And he said that naive compassion, empathy that ignores consequences. And Allie Beth Stuckey also points out that kind of empathy teaches us that boundaries are hateful and that standards are oppressive. And so instead of helping people rise, we just continue to lower the bar until nobody has to change. It's okay if you break the law. We still want to treat you with compassion. It's okay if you harm other people. We still want to treat you with compassion. Is their thought, right? And so while on the one hand, and this can be applied to almost any social problem that we're experiencing right now. It can be applied to immigration, it can be applied to abortion, it can be applied to, pick your social hot button topic. And this truth, I think, can be applied to it. In the instance of immigration, for example, their heart goes out to the immigrant. Their heart goes out to the people who are being injured or even killed in some cases, resisting what they believe to be an improper or overly aggressive enforcement of immigration law. And their compassion is all in that direction. while at the same time seemingly ignoring the fact that a lot of these people that ICE is seeking to deport, for example, um, also harmed other people. There are people who have been murdered by illegal immigrants. There are people who have been raped by illegal immigrants. So, what compassion is extended in that direction? And that is where justice has to be applied as a counterbalance and a temperament to our compassion. Yes, we want to treat everyone fairly. We want to treat everybody with compassion, but law and justice also matters. And excessive empathy to a lawbreaker is injustice and a lack of mercy to the people who are injured by that lawlessness. And so, again, I commend the underlying heart of compassion that I think is probably there in a lot of these cases, but it certainly has to be, in order to be truly loving, we have to temper that empathy with truth and justice.
Yeah, and in the whole story, because there's sometimes there's elements of truth, but they leave parts of it out. And you just brought up the illegal immigrant conversation, so that's a great example of where, from an intersectionality lens, there's a lot of people who just look at all illegal immigrants as an oppressed group. Therefore, they need extra judicial justice or whatever to help them out. When you pointed out there's plenty of those illegal immigrants that have committed heinous crimes in America to Americans, to women, to children, to everybody. Um, Now, what percentage, I don't know off the top of my head. And a lot of them do come for just, they want to just make a living in America and raise a family. So it's both. It's not one or the others. Neither side can, neither it's mostly on the left, those on the left who want to protect all illegal immigrants without looking at what the individuals are doing are wrong. And at the same time, those who have no compassion for any illegal immigrants is also wrong. And does, in my opinion, and does ICE make mistakes? I guarantee they do. I mean, every organization that I've ever been in makes mistakes. In the military, on deployments, we have very clear rules of engagement, things like that. But mistakes happen, and but we so and it's a very contentious issue, because so much of it is on, makes it on TV, um, and a lot of very violent engagements happen when it comes to ICE and illegal immigration, and it's tragic. It's unbelievably tragic when anyone dies in any of these confrontations, or if anyone is apprehended, inadvertently because they're hanging around or they're near other illegal immigrants. But that doesn't make it right to just automatically put all illegal immigrants in a category and then say that they're all an oppressed group and that must be defended without any enforcement of the law, which is passed by Congress, and the laws are passed by Congress that ICE is operating under. Um, so it's a very tough topic, and it does pull on the heartstrings as Christians, the plight of illegal immigrants, um, the ones that are not doing nefarious things, in the country. It's another topic. I don't want to go down that road too much, but
Yeah.
um,
Even those
go
who
ahead.
aren't involved in nefarious activities, though, by allowing them to stay, there's a level of injustice that is being leveled at people who are still on the other side of the border waiting their turn to do it the right way. It's
That's true.
unjust to them
That's
by
true.
granting amnesty to people who did it the wrong way.
Yeah. So it just gets back to me. I'll read a couple scriptures, where the Bible talks about how believers are supposed to act towards the needy. So Micah chapter 6, verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. 22:39 says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there's just tons and tons of scripture that talk about how we're supposed to be as believers and supposed to act as believers, and that is empathy. If we didn't have any empathy at all and just didn't care about the plight of others, then we're not being Christians. We're not acting as we believe in what God says in the Bible.
Can you
Yeah,
can
it's a
you
tough
read
topic.
can you read that translation that you have there from Micah 6:8 one more time?
Yeah, like a 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And this is the Legacy Standard Bible, which is an updated version of the New American Standard Bible translation.
I hadn't thought of that verse in this context before, but I'm glad you brought it up. And the reason I asked you to read your translation again is because, the King James that I read over here has slightly different wording. It says, He has shown thee, O man, what is good and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And I hadn't made that connection before, but when you brought up the verse, it's exactly what we were just talking about. There's a balance between love, justice, and mercy. And that, as a whole, is what is defined as good. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. And I think that balance is really missing in a lot of the public conversation, and certainly it's missing in a lot of the public demonstrations that we see. You may love mercy, empathy. You may actually even love justice. But if the way you make that argument isn't also humble, probably not making your point as effectively as you would hope. Anyway, that was really good. Thanks for bringing that verse up. I hadn't made that connection
Yeah,
in this context before.
yeah, absolutely.
Justice and mercy.
And I think I forgot to say at the beginning of this podcast that this kind of came up as an issue like literally last night because Hillary Clinton wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine. I think it was on January 29th, just a couple days ago, attacking or criticizing Ellie Beth Stuckey and the whole concept of toxic empathy, which to me indicates that if Hillary Clinton is writing an article in the Atlantic magazine attacking this topic, it's because I think the topic, giving it a definition to the idea of toxic empathy versus biblical empathy versus healthy empathy is working in the sense it's gotten into the public discourse.
Hillary Rodham Clinton, of all people, just published an op-ed in the Atlantic focused on yours truly. So why now? Why Hillary Rodham Clinton? We are over the target. We have gotten to the heart of progressive manipulation. We looked at their lies straight in the face, that abortion is healthcare, that trans women are women, that no human being is illegal, and we said, no, I see what you're doing. And we are going to give that a name. And not only that, but we're not buying it anymore. You aren't going to exploit my compassion to support policies that are bad for my family and bad for the country. No longer am I going to allow my emotion to paralyze my critical thinking. And now they're afraid. This is the tool that progressives have used to capture women for a very long time. And they thought they had the female vote in the bag forever. So when you have a woman, a Christian, a wife, a regular suburban mom, talking to other Christian wives and moms about critical thinking and biblical truth, they know they're in trouble. They don't trot out former Secretary of State, former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton unless they are really worried.
People are able to kind of now decipher between the different types of empathy, what we just read out of Micah 6:8 out of the Bible versus the toxic version. Because if you can't define things, it becomes very, very difficult to, especially if it's a very nuanced argument like this one is, very nuanced argument. And I'll admit, a lot of gray area. It's not all black and white. All these situations because you got to look at things, back to this illegal immigration thing, look at it from a legal standpoint, from just a humanity standpoint, to a Christian standpoint. There is some gray area in those boundaries, and also some clear lines. But that's where words and concepts and emotions are exploited in order to, in my opinion, blur those lines even more. So, a lot of it, and a lot of it's political based, politics based. Whether if you hate, one party, or hate what one president is doing, it's exploiting these concepts and these ideas to sow division, sow conflict, which is definitely happening now. But again, so back to the fact that Hillary Clinton wrote that article in the Atlantic. Allie Beth Stuckey, because she kind of came after Allie Beth Stuckey directly, came out with a video. I think it was yesterday. Released a video off her normal cycle, because she felt compelled to defend and correct the record, because of course a lot of the accusations were not fairly or in full context. Anyway, I'm not even going to read stuff from the Atlantic, because Miss Clinton, makes it directly political against, Trump and the Republican Party, and I don't want to get into the politics too directly, because to me it's a much larger issue than that. And but you see how what Ellie Beth Stuckey's perspective is on toxic empathy is purposely mischaracterized. And anyway, that's all. I just wanted to point that out. And I think the point being that, again, the book was released in October 2024, that Ellie Beth Stuckey put out, and now God Sad's coming out here later this year with Suicidal Empathy. And I'm just grateful for finally somebody coming out with a way to articulate clearly how empathy can be hijacked, and has been hijacked in a lot of cases. Because again, if you can't define it, if you can't define what's happening, then it just keeps happening, and you kind of spin in circles trying to find a way to combat it. And those who adhere to Marxist ideology tend to be really good at manipulating words and concepts and weaponizing them. And kind of traditional folks, your typical conservative folks, don't even think that way. We just kind of, by design, we think traditionally. We think words have the traditional meaning that they started out with, 100, 200, 300 years ago. We don't think about how to use them in different ways. I think we end up kind of on our heels a lot of times when things like this are weaponized and disrupt society, and it's hard to even figure out how that happened, and how to define what has happened, how to define how words have been hijacked. Diversity, equity, inclusion, obviously another example. Those words by themselves, with their traditional original meaning, are fine, but when they're weaponized for a different purpose, that's led to a lot of division, in order to, again, to help groups that are defined as oppressed in the intersectionality ladder, which again sounds like a compassionate motivation. The tool that's used to correct those perceived imbalances, and there are imbalances. I'm not saying perceived as in they don't exist. There are imbalances all throughout society, and always have been, and always will be. But not whole groups of people are imbalanced or oppressed. Again, it comes down to me to focus on the individual, and knowing that there are people who do oppress or are biased against groups based on ethnicity. That's a fact. That is still a fact today. And Christian morality, biblical morality, is against that idea. And again, it comes back down to me for the church to influence society with moral biblical teachings so that less and less people believe those incorrect views about judging people based on ethnicity, for example. If it wasn't for biblical views, if it wasn't for frankly Christianity, the concept in the Declaration of Independence would have never been written, because it was heavily, heavily influenced by biblical teachings about individual rights and freedom and equality in God's eyes. That's just a fact. Even though America started out not adhering to that statement, it led to more and more freedom over time, both in America and in the Western world, and generally speaking, around the world. So another diatribe. Will stop there.
No, that's good. The point about defining words is a very key and critical point. And you mentioned that, conservatives normally, that's not the pool that they normally swim in. I don't remember where I saw or heard this pointed out, but traditionally conservatives are more of your blue collar workers. They're farmers, they're factory workers, machinists, whatever, people that work with their hands. And for maybe the last century or so, the other side, the left, are more prone to work in universities, or to be lawyers, or to be involved in more academic pursuits, if you will. And that's where definitions live. That's where words get defined. That's where culture is created. And that's been recognized by a variety of different groups and people. For the last 2 episodes, we were talking about how it's important for Christians in the church to be involved in government and politics, whereas conventional wisdom insists that they should not be, that you shouldn't mix religion and politics, and Christians should stay out of that sphere. But after that episode, you had shared the video clip of that representative from CARE talking about the 20-year plan to advance the cause of Muslims and Islam in the United States. And it's interesting, he pointed out the fact that there are 4,000 mosques in the United States. And his challenge for each of those 4,000 mosques was every year for the next 20 years, provide scholarships for 5 individuals, 5 Muslims, to go to school and study one of 5 different disciplines. And 3 of those disciplines were to get somebody trained in journalism, 1 to be trained in film, 1 to be trained in the law, and what were the other 2? Do you remember? Those were the 3 that stuck out to me.
Those are the big 3. Yeah, there's a couple more.
Because literally those 3 things shape the culture. They define words. Yep. And he did the math, in that video clip, that if 4,000 mosques would sponsor just 5 students in each of those 5 areas for the next 20 years, where they would be, where the Muslim where the Muslim community and Islam in the United States would be in 20 years. So they recognize the importance of having people in place in the proper positions with the proper leverage and training to change the culture's mindset, redefine words when necessary, and then apply those levers shrewdly. And in this instance, we're already living on the end result of about 100 years of that happening in our academic institutions, and in our courts. The definition, and I share your appreciation for Allie Beth Stuckey and others trying to nail this concept down and apply a definition to it. And kind of a mix, if you mixed Allie Beth Stuckey and Jordan Peterson's definition of what toxic empathy is, it would be a tendency to prioritize emotional comfort and perceived compassion over truth, moral boundaries, accountability, and reality, often leading to policies or personal decisions that ultimately harm individuals and society. So to this point in this episode, we've cautioned that somehow toxic empathy is dangerous. And so maybe it's useful using that definition to explain what is the danger of toxic empathy. Like, if you follow that to its natural end and to its extreme, what are the results that are so dangerous and detrimental, in our opinion?
Yeah, I mean, we look for your comments, by the way, on what you all think about this this whole topic, and if empathy, as it's applied today in a lot of political senses, is toxic. Um, and some examples of where you might think it's healthy in society and where it's not. Um, back to the laws that immigration enforcement are following. A lot of people disagree with how, not only how those laws are being enforced, but that they're being enforced at all. But they're laws, and that gets into the whole sanctuary city thing. That just cities and sometimes states choosing not to enforce laws that Congress passed that are supposed to be enforced fairly and equally across the country. Um,
Much easier to shout it down than to go through the hard process of actually changing the law if we don't like it. Right.
yeah, and there may be aspects of the law that are not perfect because again, humans are making these laws, and we're not perfect. And this, that gets to a point like protesting, truly peacefully protesting is fine, and it's a way to speak against things you don't like in society. Very healthy. Of course, obstructing law enforcement is not legal. Does lead to the conflicts that we've seen around the country recently. But how many people also lobby their congressman or woman to change the laws? Because that's who created the laws. Congress creates the laws. And law enforcement is just trying to fulfill, enforce those laws. And of course, different administrations are going to put different priorities on different laws around the country. Obviously, President Trump has prioritized illegal immigration and cracking down on it and stopping it from happening. And the prior administration turned a blind eye to a lot of these laws and let this rampant illegal immigration happen in the first place. But again, you don't have to like the law, but if you don't like it, then lobby your congressman, organize people in groups to come up with a way to bring up alternative solutions to get the law changed. But in the meantime, and be empathetic. If you don't like what you're seeing, of course, be empathetic about it. Like I started out by saying that a lot of these conflicts that have happened are absolutely tragic. From my the compassion that I have as a Christian, when anyone is killed, for any reason, is there should be some kind of a moral reaction that anyone has. You and I have been in combat and have experienced combat casualties. And even if you were inflicting harm on an enemy force, fulfilling a lawful mission, there should be a moral reaction inside of you. You should have some kind of moral function about what's happening. So I don't like to see any death. But if people, at the same time, some of these deaths we've seen on TV are because they're not just peacefully protesting; they're actually obstructing lawful enforcement of the laws that are leading to this, and that's not the way to do it. That's not the right way to protest. It doesn't justify necessarily the death that happened, and again, those will be investigated as to why the law enforcement pull the trigger in those cases. But going down a rabbit trail here in my head, I can't close the loop on this, but it's just
Well,
go
it's
ahead.
kind of an aside. We're not really specifically talking about protests today, but you made me think just now. So people have a right to protest, and they insist on it. We spent 2 episodes recently talking about the Constitution and the First Amendment, specifically where that right to protest comes from. But again, the words matter. The actual words of the amendment matter, and the word protest, I don't believe, appears anywhere in the Constitution, and it definitely doesn't appear in the First Amendment. What the First Amendment does protect, though, is the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That essentially is a protest. But it's a peaceable assembly, petitioning for the redress of grievances. And so I hadn't thought about this before. So you just laid out your argument, as you just did. Is this a fair statement? Drop us a comment. In addition to it being peaceful, a peaceful assembly, could legitimate protests be broken down into one of 2 categories? In order to be legitimate, you either have to be protesting in an effort to get the government to follow existing law, meaning their behavior is currently lawless, in which case the protest is to insist that our government and our representatives come back to the pathway of actually following the law as it currently exists. That's one legitimate form of protest. The second would be, we think the law is unjust, and therefore the protest is to have the law or the policy changed. And I can't, at least not off the top of my head, I can't think of any other scenario, any other situation where a protest would be justified if it doesn't fall into one of those 2 categories. Maybe I'm missing something. So again, if there's another scenario that I haven't thought of here, please drop it in the comments. But in my mind, just thinking off the cuff, it seems like those are the only 2 legitimate reasons to protest, either to insist the law be followed as it currently exists or to change the law as it currently exists. And if it's the latter, until that law is changed, it does have to be enforced. Anyway, what do you think, Jim? Is there a third possibility that I'm not thinking of?
I don't think so. I think a law, if a law is passed by Congress, Congress represents the people. Any law that's passed in Congress, almost by definition, is a compromise of some kind, because you can't. There's going to be different aspects, but if it comes to the point of actually getting consensus amongst Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, and across the spectrum, and it incorporates, if it's a national law, it's supposed to be applied equally across all the states, and every single state is different, and every single city is different. So it should be enforced equally. That should be Congress shouldn't think, okay, we're going to pass this law and we don't know how it's going to be enforced, and maybe but we can't control that, but no one's thinking that way. That's not how the Constitution was designed. So a law is supposed to be applicable to the whole country. And again, back to the 10th Amendment in the Constitution, laws should only be passed if it should be a national law. Otherwise, let the states take care of the states and how they run their states. It's the whole purpose of so there should be relatively few laws, and that's a whole other topic. There's way too many laws passed that across the country that are we're very bureaucratic, and we've gone far away from the idea of individual states.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about
running their
regulatory
states
chapter some other time. That's an interesting topic in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a good topic that we should do that soon. Actually, probably that topic, and then the convention of states kind of movement that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think for a protest to be legitimate, it should fall into one of those 2 categories, and then the third thing to make it legitimate and constitutionally protected is it has to be a peaceful assembly. And
yes.
That's not what we have been seeing. These assemblies, these protests that we've seen are anything but peaceful. And even if you're justified on one of the other two counts, unless it's peaceful, it's not constitutionally protected. Anyway,
Right.
not what we're here to talk about. According to the
No, yeah, I mean,
words of the First Amendment.
yeah, another theme kind of this popped up a lot in our podcast is just the idea of free speech and how it's so important. Respectful free speech is very important. Adding the word respect in there, that's very very rarely ever brought up. Because how do you enforce respectful speech? You can't enforce it, so a lot of people will tend to not be respectful about it. If it's respectful free speech, even if it's full of passion, full of emotion, but respectful towards the other perspective, then it's more likely to be listened to and considered versus the anger and vitriol that we see a lot today, which is just whether it's meant to or not, it tears society apart and causes, uh, just causes conflict. It doesn't lead to a lot of good results. It leads to kind of this dramatic swings politically, from far left to far right, rather than a consensus building. So somehow we've got to get back to that. And again, it's been kind of in my opinion, a sub theme of this podcast is trying to drive people to have more respectful conversations based on facts and respectful dialogue, and that gets to the free speech aspect of it. The quote unquote free speech we've been seeing is a lot of it's been destructive, and it happens on both sides.
And for sure, the underpinning of a lot of these protests that we've seen recently does, I think, come back to what we're here to talk about today. The protests are driven and fueled in many ways by this toxic empathy. So, after I read that kind of amalgamated definition of what toxic empathy is, if you listen to Allie Beth Stuckey and Jordan Peterson speak on the topic, the tendency to prioritize emotional comfort and perceived compassion over truth, moral boundaries, accountability, and reality, often leading to policies or personal decisions that ultimately harm individuals and society. So it is empathy. Uh, 5 dangers that I'll lay out for discussion. Five potential dangers that come along with this kind of empathy. One, it avoids discomfort at all costs, and not all discomfort is bad. Second, it excuses destructive behavior. Third, it rejects objective standards. That's a hot topic. Like we can't agree on objective standards these days. But fourth, it also undermines responsibility and discipline. That's huge. And then lastly, it enables long-term damage in the name of short-term kindness. So take the first danger or the first negative effect of toxic empathy of avoiding discomfort at all costs. What do you think of that? That byproduct?
Yeah, that's kind of a lack of courage, really. I mean, you got to be courageous about tackling topics that are uncomfortable or temporarily unpleasant, and just avoiding them doesn't lead to, because again, society and life is messy, and a lot of the challenges that we face in society are not straightforward. And to avoid conflict or what do you say again? To avoid discomfort.
Avoids discomfort at all costs. So in other words, there's a marginalized group, one of these intersectionalities, who this perceived compassion anyway sees that this community or this faction is in distress, at least their definition of it, and therefore, in order to alleviate that discomfort immediately, we need to resolve whatever their perceived cause of distress is. We need to remove whatever is causing the discomfort for this faction, and we need to do it now. That's essentially what toxic empathy does, right? It sees a perceived problem that they think needs to be addressed right now, and that becomes their mission.
Yeah, short-term fix for what could be a long-term systemic cultural problem that led to the result. Yeah, that's good.
And excusing destructive behavior. So what we have come to view as compassion is really enabling what everybody has to know just on a surface level observation is destructive behavior. So there is I was watching the Sean Ryan show a couple of days ago, and there was a term I had never heard before. Have you ever heard of boofing?
No.
I had neither.
Inside of Beverly Hills alone, you have homeless people sleeping outside of mansions. Like literally within just a few blocks, you have homeless people setting up their own homeless encampments. You obviously have Skid Row there. That's been a big issue for years. I mean, the homeless people literally get handed to them the needles, the paraphernalia, the rubber bands. They even get handed out to them the crack pipes to do their drugs. And then they'll be like, okay, here's this, and then here's some Narcan in case you kill yourself.
Oh, in Maine, they're handing out free boofing kits.
Yeah.
You know what a boofing kit is?
No, what is a boofing kit?
Oh, man.
Kinda have
I've
an
been
idea.
waiting for somebody to ask me this because I didn't know what it was when Steve Robinson told me what a free boofing kit was. I said, what's a boofing kit? It's like, it sounds like some type of a balloon that you
Really?
put the fentanyl in and then you just shove it up your ass.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Dang.
It's because it's for when your veins are so fucked up that they can't take any more heroin or fentanyl. You just put it in this little capsule and
Whoa.
shove it up there. New effect.
In places where they have been handing out drugs and drug paraphernalia to drug addicts, viewed again as being compassionate to these people who have an addiction, and now the state thinks, well, if we provide the materials to them, at least we know that those materials are safe, they're not sharing needles and all this sort of thing, right? And so that is a perfect example, I think, of misplaced compassion to a person struggling with substance abuse and addiction. Rather than help them overcome the addiction, they try to make the addiction safer. And in their mind, that's compassion. Well, boofing, again, as I understand it, I haven't really looked into it that much, but there are certain people who have used these substances to the point where their veins can no longer accept it. Like they've completely destroyed their veins. And so boofing is basically like a fentanyl suppository. So the state of Maine, if I understood it correctly, and maybe California as well, are providing free boofing kits to these addicts who have destroyed their veins through this addiction. And now they're basically providing a drug, as a suppository version of this drug that can be taken rectally. And this is compassion. How insane is that? Compassion that really becomes cruelty. You're helping someone kill themselves by excusing their destructive behavior rather than have the difficult and uncomfortable conversation and the work that would be involved in actually helping them.
Yeah. And before the boofing thing, it was, handing out the needles. But as you pointed out, they came up with boofing, I guess, because a lot of their veins couldn't handle the needles anymore. Just it's insanity to me. And again, that's a very good example, in my opinion, of toxic empathy, misplaced empathy. Is and I'm not a drug counselor, obviously. I've never had to help somebody get off that type of addiction. I've met a couple folks that used to be addicted to that kind of thing, and I learned a little bit more about how hard it is to get off of it. But enabling it, that just sounds. I mean, that's misplaced empathy. It's so misplaced that it's not actually empathy, in my opinion. It's the motivation's empathetic, the result is destructive. I mean, that's just mind numbing.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what Jordan Peterson was talking about when he said this type of empathy, this naive compassion taken to an extreme actually becomes cruelty. And I think that's a perfect explanation and summation of that situation. And you're right. drug addiction that's a difficult thing. Dealing with that addiction is hard work, which is why it's easier just to help them do it, as
Right.
these states are doing, right? It's much easier than doing the actual work of being truly compassionate and helping them with their problem. Um, and not to make light of this at all, but there was a comedian by the name of Mitch Hedberg. He died a number of years ago, I think, unfortunately, from an overdose. And he was talking about the addiction of smoking and trying to quit smoking. And he said, and people will tell him, it's like, you don't know how hard it is to quit smoking. And I tell them, yes, I do. It is as hard to quit smoking as it is to start flossing. And so people who think think that they know anything about breaking an addiction, do you floss? The dentist tells you to do it all the time, and most of us don't do it nearly like we should. And so, coming from Mitch Hedberg, before you
Yeah.
criticize people who can't break an addiction, try to develop the habit of flossing.
I'm glad you said that because I thought I was the only one that wasn't doing it as often as I should. Because every time I talk to my dentist every year, they guilt me. And I feel like, am I the only one that's not doing this? Jeez.
Nope, you're not. It's hard. It's hard to develop that habit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so avoiding the discomfort of these hard conversations and the hard work that's necessary to be truly compassionate, excusing destructive behavior. The third one is rejecting objective standards. Toxic empathy leads us to reject objective standards. What are your thoughts on that?
To reject objective standards. Can you define what you mean? What I guess what he means by objective standards?
Well, I think I don't know what he means, and I don't know that either Allie Beth Stuckey or Jordan Peterson have laid it out exactly like this. This is just kind of a way to look at it. But I would
Yeah. So,
I would turn to a discussion of the transgender issues of how we're treating children, mutilating children really, and calling it compassion because of their gender dysphoria or their confusion. Again, difficult conversation to have. It's destructive behavior, but because we refuse to impose an objective, scientific, by the way, standard of what male and female is, our toxic empathy leads us to reject that objective standard, refuse the discomfort of having this challenging conversation with the child and to be a parent and help them through it, and instead just excuse and even enable the destructive behavior.
yeah. Yeah. Just objective being just factual, I guess you could say. Going right into emotion, and the medical industry helped enable that a little bit by giving they were saying that by not supporting gender transition, parents or caretakers were taking the risk of that child committing suicide. So, and they were claiming that was empirically backed up, and it turned out it wasn't. But a lot of in the medical industry in both the UK and the United States gave that idea credibility, made it sound objective that it's better to do the gender transition for the sake of the child, and it turned out that was false. But for many years, a lot of people believed it. So that's an example of how objectivity can be either purposely or mistakenly. I'm sure many medical professionals mistakenly believed that was true and parroted it. But yeah, just getting the actual facts behind decisions, both medical, policy wise, etc.
Yeah, it seems that they kind of only want to invoke science when it's convenient, when it supports, or when they perceive that it supports their point. But I think as science has continued to progress and develop, I think the scientific objection to transgenderism and abortion has only gotten stronger. And the proponents of transgenderism ideology, the pro-choice movement, their scientific argument has just gotten weaker and weaker and weaker. And as it's weakened, they've decided that maybe science doesn't matter as much as they thought. And it's really just how do we feel about a particular thing, which is another hallmark of toxic empathy. It's focuses on how does this make me feel as opposed to what is true and what is good.
Right.
The fourth danger associated here with toxic empathy is that it undermines responsibility and discipline.
Undermines, say it again.
Responsibility and discipline. I would say individual responsibility and discipline.
Yeah, I don't know if this is where this is going or what the intent of that exactly is, but I referred to it earlier where it's easy to take an emotional argument on something to quote unquote support an oppressed group or whatever, vice actually tangibly helping the person or the group or whatever it is, which takes discipline, it takes sacrifice. So I'm not sure if that's what the direction they're going with that. 'Cause it's much easier from your couch and your phone and your use your thumbs to take a position and bash a certain, whether it's law enforcement or whatever it is that are following the law, because the way they're enforcing the law that impacts certain people rather than going and helping those people yourself. I'm not sure if that's the angle is taken there, but that's how I interpreted that.
I think that's certainly part of it. I think the other side of it and how toxic empathy is applied in that way is that, you know, I think two examples of this would be the welfare system and our criminal justice system. Their objections to both the objection to one and the advocacy for the other. Where the criminal justice system is concerned, certain behavior is excused in certain demographics because of a perceived, the environment they grew up in has made them this way. And so therefore we should feel sorry for them and excuse their bad behavior because it's not their fault. Whether they had a long history of oppression or slavery or just they grew up in a bad neighborhood, right? And our empathy, toxic empathy would be, we need to excuse any and all bad behavior from this group because of the struggles that they've had in the past. Which ironically is exactly the opposite to what Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for. We talked about him last week, where he said he dreamed of a country where his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And toxic empathy has flipped that. And now we excuse the content of character because of the color of skin in many cases.
Right. Right.
So that's in the realm of criminal justice. That's one way that toxic empathy, I think, has been detrimental. Welfare is the other side of that equation, to where, again, by the same reasoning, society owes X, Y, or Z to a group of people because of struggles or injustices that they've suffered in the past. Which both of those things undermines the individual responsibility for the person and also undermines individual discipline. I don't have to be disciplined in my actions anymore because it's going to be excused because of things that have happened in the past. And I'm not responsible to provide for myself or conduct myself in a certain way, again, because of past injustices. The last and fifth detrimental effect of toxic empathy that we'll talk about here is that it enables long-term damage in the name of short-term kindness. And I think everything we've talked about to this point, whether we're talking about drug addiction, crime, welfare, or immigration, toxic empathy applied in any one of those four areas enables, it looks like short-term kindness, but it is actually enabling long-term damage. It's destroying the long-term health, not just of the individual, but of the ecosystem, the system in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. I was going to say the first four kind of lead to the fifth, it seems like, in a lot of cases. So yeah, I've thought a lot about how to articulate this idea in another way. Um, you know, as a parent with a child, it's not a perfect analogy, but if you only gave the child what the child wanted, and as you know, especially when they're infants, they cry, they want the candy, they want the, they want the whatever will make them happy in that moment, and it's tempting as a parent to want to just give the child the candy or whatever it is that they're crying about, in the grocery aisle of the store when you're embarrassed and your child's throwing a temper tantrum or whatever. So the easy short-term answer is just give them the candy. It's just to get them to stop crying. But that's not healthy for the child, and it in multiple ways. It's candy. It's bad for them. Contributes to cavities. It contributes to bad eating habits, and it also promotes the child just expecting that anytime the child cries for whatever they want, the parent's going to give it to them. I think that is I'm not trying to like make it sound like truly needy groups, they have legitimate needs, but to just do the short-term fix or the short-term, and sometimes that short-term quote unquote fix is to make the person that's doing the fix feel better. Like I'm doing something to help the person. But if it only enables the problem, if it enables, if it's a societal, cultural issue that has led to, we've talked about the drug addiction thing. If you don't have a culture that is healthy, that teaches good morality, teaches, strong family values, um, teaches that, you know, law enforcement of legally enacted and crafted laws is a good thing for society. If that promotes education, um, all these cultural, and promotes um, marriage and not having children out of wedlock, things like that. Those are hard to get a society to agree to these kind of things, and they can't all be laws that enforces them. It's got to be a societal thing. But if you just don't even try to talk about those tough things that prove statistically that a lot of these things that I just mentioned help individuals grow into healthier, productive individuals, and of course help society be productive. And you just do the short-term fix for the societal ills that always pop up, then you're just enabling that. It doesn't mean that there can't be sometimes short-term fixes if it's calculated. If it's like, okay, we need to fix something this or mitigate this thing right now, while at the same time addressing the structural issue that led to this problem. So yeah, it's just again back to the candy thing and the child. It's easy to do the short-term thing. I think back, I'm going to get into little complexities here, but I think about Social Security. Um, I'm not prepared to talk about it. I don't remember what year was passed and any of that stuff, but if Social Security was structured to, that Social Security was set up because I would argue, you and I weren't alive when it passed, but that people weren't, I think it was a reaction to the Great Depression, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not positive. I'm pretty sure it was. That people weren't saving enough to be able to kind of have a cushion for a major economic problem, or when they retired, they didn't have enough savings So government came up with a system to kind of force people to have some kind of retirement, so that when they retire, they have some kind of financial cushion, which you could argue takes a little bit of burden off the government from feeling they have to do that after the fact, if that makes sense. But if Social Security, so when it was passed right off the bat, current workers were funding current retirees. Whereas if it was structured where current workers were saving for their own retirement, that would be a system that would work perpetually. I hope I'm making sense here. But because the amount of current workers and retirees fluctuates over time based on birth rates and death rates, it's thrown it completely out of whack. And, we've been here for about 15, 20 years now that the Social Security system is going to go bankrupt. Because, you had a baby boomer generation, and then the birth rate went down. And so it just throws it out of whack. But if it was set up from the get-go, which my point is, if they set up from the get-go of like, okay, hey, we're going to pass this law that forces or requires people to, take a certain amount of their income and put it into some kind of Social Security kind of savings account kind of thing, for when that law passes, it doesn't benefit the current retirees. So it was probably going to be less, there'd be less movement behind it because no one sees the benefit immediately. But that would have been the right thing to do. I hope I'm making sense. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
hey, let's do the short-term fix.
Go ahead.
Say again?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So just like, hey, let's do this fix that has an immediate benefit, but structurally it's unsound over time. Whereas if they did it the right way, which would have taken discipline and a lot more, communication with the public, like, hey, current retirees, sorry, this isn't going to help you, but this is a system that will help, society over time. So again, another tangent, just to point out that there's right ways to do policies or better ways to do policies, and then there's also the short-term way that has a short-term impact that's more politically viable at that time, but is not a structurally sound example.
Yeah, very, very populated baby boomer generation, lots of people in that generation, followed by a declining birth rate and rising unemployment, of the generation that would be paying into their Social Security because of the arrangement you just talked about. And that's why it's unsustainable. There's not enough people currently working to provide Social Security benefits for the people who have already supposedly technically earned them. But the person that is benefiting is disconnected from the earned dollar that supports them in their retirement. So yeah, it's a complicated issue. You were talking about the analogy of the child getting what they want. Great minds think alike, because I literally just earlier today heard Nick Freitas make that exact same analogy.
Interesting.
Maybe we'll throw that in here because he did it. He did it very well, as he does everything. But as we bring it down to a close, we'll come back to the fact that, when Christians especially are made to feel guilty for not being compassionate or empathetic enough, it's this definition that they're being held to. This kind of empathy is what we're being told we have to subscribe to, or we're not Christian, or we're not Christ-like. I would say that when Christ gave the commandment, "This is my commandment, that you love one another, and that your joy may be full," what did he mean by love? His own example of compassion, real compassion, I would offer in closing, is not about avoiding the discomfort that we talked about. It's about pursuing what is true and what is good, even when that truth and that is hard. Toxic empathy trades long-term health, long-term flourishing for this short-term emotional relief. And it's really emotional relief for the person who is feeling the empathy. It's not for the overall good of the person that they're feeling empathetic about. And in doing so, applying empathy in that way, it actually weakens the individual, it weakens families, it weakens entire cultures, as we were just talking about. And I think if we want to build stronger people, we want to build healthier communities, we have to have the courage to pair true empathy with truth, to combine kindness with ability. They're not mutually exclusive, and we have to combine grace with responsibility. And I would offer that is not cruelty. That is true love in the sense that Christ intended.
Yeah, I think I'll end with this is that I think if the goal, if we look at it as, again, back to every individual, if you believe, and if anyone believes or comes at it from the perspective that every individual has a God-given purpose in life, God-given potential to have an impact in their society, and you come across a strung out, addicted, homeless person on the street, or unhoused person, as they say, on the corner, and they're pleading for money, or they truly are hungry and want money for food, but they could use that money potentially for drugs or whatever. You don't know. So it's a tough situation. How do you help that person? Like, is helping that person, like, what's the motivation? Is it just to make them more comfortable, or is the end motivation that, the one person helping at that moment may not be able to get them to this point? But if the mindset is, okay, this person is not meeting his or her God-given potential, and I want to help them get to that point, whether that's through an organization or through a nonprofit or individually or through the church. I think if that was the starting mindset, that would change how we choose to, quote unquote, help people in need. If you start out with a perspective that a group of people, based on their ethnicity or situation or gender identity or whatever, um, can't meet a high level of God-given potential because they're perpetually oppressed or whatever, that's the wrong mindset, in my opinion. And anyway, I'm kind of going in a couple different directions there, but one of them being, again, back to the person on the corner that's on drugs. Like, if you start out with that person was created by God for a purpose, it's not fulfilling his purpose right now. I can pretty much guarantee it. What role can I play? What small role can I play individually to help get that person on the right track? That could change that mindset would change what thing that you do. And it wouldn't, like, for example, it would be probably not be giving that person money. It would probably give them food, and people do this now. You hear that a lot. They don't just give somebody on the corner money, you give them food. So to make sure that the money isn't used for the wrong purpose. You can just tell them, God has a purpose for your life. This isn't it. God sees you differently than the situation you're in right now. He sees you with a potential. It's, putting them in touch with organizations. And this is something that I just found out recently. There's an organization where I live called Shared City, and they connect ministries and nonprofits around the city that are designed to help homeless people and those in need. And one of the things they do, and they create these cards with information on them, and it's warming shelters, job training sites, it's drug addiction locations, whatever. And they give these cards out, and they're laminated. And so now when I see a homeless person on the corner, and I don't have time to help that person, just I have somewhere to get to. Now I have something to give them, because I don't know exactly what their situation is. I don't know if they're on drugs. I don't know if they got a child somewhere. I don't know if they just lost their job. But this card has information that they can use if they want to use it to get the help they need. So that's an example of just starting out with a different mindset of, this person is a human being created by God. They're in a bad situation. This is not the life they want to be living right now. And, what can I do to help them think that way? And then kind of propel them on the right direction. So that's, Yeah, I think that whole mentality would change. And I think that is frankly the Christian mentality. And I think that is why the church is the best equipped, in my opinion, to help people, because they look at it, start out with that perspective more or less, that yeah, this person's created by God, and that's why I have compassion for them. Not just because they're a living human being. That's all obviously very important. Life is precious. All life is precious. But it's that God gave them a specific potential. They're not living up to their potential. What can I do to get them on the right track?
That's an important point too. And I was just thinking as you were talking about that to- toxic empathy is outsourced empathy. Normally, it's not a personal empathy that they're referring to. Toxic empathy is usually upset because someone else or some other organization isn't acting as empathetic as the person who is toxically empathetic thinks they should be, and it's not that individual. Um, True compassion is an individual thing. And you were just talking about it, trying to help people on the corner. And it made me think back when the discomfort that we talked about that can be involved with truth and compassion. It's not just the discomfort, and people should be warned about this before they go out and try to be personally compassionate and empathetic. The discomfort isn't just uh, related to the uncomfortable conversations you might have to have about truth with people. As you just pointed out, you really can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped. And not everybody does. Some people they are, they are, I don't want to use the word happy, but they're kind of content in their misfortunes. And you can't help them if they don't want to be helped, or if they don't even recognize the need for help. And so there's also a discomfort and a disappointment and a sense of failure that comes to you when you've tried to help somebody and failed, because they either didn't want your help, they rejected your help, or you just weren't able to help them. And your story reminded me when I lived in North Carolina, when I was stationed at Marine Corps Air Station New River. Every morning and every night, I would drive back and forth to work along Fire Tower Road in Richlands, North Carolina. And almost every day, I would see a poor lady walking down the side of that road. It's Richlands, North Carolina. There's no sidewalks. So it's ditches on both sides. And so she would be limping down the side of Fire Tower Road, picking up cigarette butts. And she would smoke these used cigarette butts. And she would do that. And it almost didn't matter any time of the day or night. If it was daylight outside, I can almost guarantee I would see this woman walking up and down the road looking for used cigarette butts. My heart really went out to her. And I felt like God put it on my heart to stop and talk to her. And so I did. And I kind of developed a friendship with her. I would stop
Wow.
often and I would talk to her. And I got to know her. And it was clear that her mind was gone. She was strung out on drugs. She had a lot of problems. And I learned where she lived, and I would go visit her from time to time. I would take her food. My family and I started picking her up. I invited her to come to church with me. And I started picking her up on Sunday mornings. We would go to where she lived, and she would come to church, and we would always make sure she got fed, breakfast before church. And if she wanted lunch afterward, we would make sure she got that too. But her mind was so destroyed by the drugs that she had already done. I tried to get her help. I tried to get her into places that could help her. She eventually stopped coming to church with us. She didn't go to any of take advantage of any of the resources that I tried to hook her up with. And eventually she disappeared. To this day, I don't know what happened to her. But I say all that to say that there's discomfort involved in trying to be compassionate even the right way, because now you have to live with the fact that you tried to help somebody and couldn't. You failed. But we should still do it. And that's part of that discomfort that's involved sometimes with trying to do the right thing. Anyway.
That's a sad, but good story, man. Yeah, that's we're a broken society. We're again back to we talked about utopia at the beginning. We're never going to get utopia. all you can do is try to do the right thing for the person in front of you, and none of us do it to the level we should. That's a great example of you stepping up and doing the right thing and trying to help that person. And you know, you don't know, since you lost touch with her, you don't know how that's changed her life, or if her life could be changed if her mind was just so gone. But you definitely showed the love of Christ. That's for darn sure. And hopefully that made a difference. And she went to church a few times. Hopefully that made a difference in her, and that God got a hold of her. And it's all you can do. Just do your part, and you definitely did it. That's an awesome story.
Yeah. Well, we'd encourage folks, stay away from toxic empathy. Try to exercise true compassion, mercy, and justice. That is literally how God defines good.
Yep.
Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
Very well said. Thanks again, brother. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Good complex discussion. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up. Enjoyed
Yeah,
it.
man. Absolutely.
All right, man.
God
See you
bless.
next
Stay
time.
warm out there. Big
God-
storm coming through the whole East Coast, so hope everybody is safe.
Thank you.
See ya.